usa ka religious non-governmental organization nga padala usab og mga translator missionaries sa mga bukid-bukid aron tun-an ang pinulungang sa mga lumad o minority tribes ug dayon magbuhat og mga vernacular Bible sama sa Tausog, Maranao, Samal, Manobo ug uban pa. Ang dakong katuyuan ning tanan aron nga makatunan gayod sa tanang tawo ang Biblia nga maoy pulong sa Dios sa ilang kaugalingong lingwahe o pinulungan. How the Bible entered English. The first translation of portions of the Bible into English occurred much earlier when metrical paraphrases of the Bible were reportedly written in Old English in the 8th century. However, no copies of these works have survived. Our earliest surviving manuscripts of biblical texts in English are the West Saxon Gospels dating from around the 10th century. We also possess manuscripts of an 11th century English translation of the Hexateuch from Genesis to Joshua. In time, as the English language changed, however, such early translations were no longer used. While we often call the Elizabethan English of the King James Version Old English, it is actually an early form of modern English. These early translations were in the very much early Saxon or true Old English. Occasionally, vernacular translations were made in various languages during the Middle Ages, including some in English, like the 12th century Psalter by Richard Rolle. Early English Bible translations. The next major translation of the Bible into English was the John Wycliffe Bible of the 14th century. John Wycliffe was in many ways a forerunner to the Protestant Reformation. He also inspired the first complete translation of the entire Bible in English. Wycliffe believed that the Bible belonged to all the people of God, and it was this out of conviction that arose the effort to bring the Bible into the common English of the day. Wycliffe's teachings helped plant the seeds that would later sprout into the Protestant Reformation. When the Reformation began through men like Martin Luther, they quickly recognized the need to make the Word of God available in the language spoken by everyday Christians. The Bible was not only for people who were wealthy and educated to read Latin or scholarly enough to know the original Greek and Hebrew. It was in the midst of this Reformation fervor of devotion to the Word of God that an Englishman named William Tyndale came to the conviction that the English people too needed a Bible in the common tongue of their day. Not only was the English of the Wycliffe Bible already out of date, the Wycliffe Bible was a translation of the Latin Vulgate, and Tyndale wanted to produce a translation that went back to the Greek and Hebrew original. Greek manuscripts were not readily available in the West, but an affordable printed edition of the complete Greek New Testament had recently been available primarily through the labor of a man named Desiderius Erasmus. Erasmus had published the first edition of his Greek New Testament in 1516, with four other editions between 1519 and 1536. Erasmus derived his text primarily from two 12th century Greek New Testament manuscripts and one from the 10th century. He had also access to one incomplete manuscript of the Book of Revelation. To fill in the occasional gaps in his manuscript, Erasmus translated into Greek from the Latin Vulgate. It was in these few places a Greek translation of a Latin translation of a Greek original. In 1526, William Tyndale published the first edition of his English New Testament, a translation from Erasmus' Greek text. The Hebrew text for the Old Testament, preferred by The Reformers was the printed edition of the Hebrew Bible produced by the Christian scholar Daniel Bomberg and Felix Pretensis. Using such tools, as well as likely consulting the Septuagint, the Vulgate, and Martin Luther's work, Tyndale published the English Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, in 1530. He was preparing the second section of the Old Testament when he was arrested and ultimately executed for his doctrine and for his translations. This was later used in the production of the 1537 Matthew Bible. Tyndale died having not yet completed his goal. One of his associates, Miles Coverdale, carried on the work after him. In 1535, the Coverdale Bible was published, becoming the first complete Bible in modern English. Shortly afterward, in 1537, a man named John Rogers released a Bible under the pseudonym Thomas Matthew. The Matthew Bible was a revision of Coverdale's Bible. It was not long after this that the English crown began to see the value of having the Bible in the native English tongue. The state actually commissioned the first official authorized version of the English Bible, which was published in 1539. The resulting translation came to be known as the Great Bible, in part because its copies were printed very large and were meant for formal use in church services rather than for personal study at home. Other authorized versions would follow, namely the Bishop's Bible, published in several revisions from 1568 to 1602, and finally, the famous King James Version of 1911. However, persecution against the Protestants broke out again in England, and its key leaders temporarily fled to Geneva, where they published the influential Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible was a monument for several reasons. Miles Coverdale, the author, did not know Hebrew. The portions of the Old Testament translated by him and retained in the Matthew and Great Bibles were translations of translations. The Geneva Bible is thus the first English Bible to be wholly translated from the Hebrew Old Testament and Greek New Testament from the beginning to end. The Geneva Bible was also the first collaborative translation by a team or committee of scholars rather than by one primary translator with only assistance from others. The Geneva Bible was the first English translation to use verse numbers. It also included extensive study notes to aid the reader in understanding the sense of the passage, so much so that it is often considered the first English Bible study Bible. The Geneva Bible was widely popular and remained so even in many years after the King James Version was published. In a real way, the publication of the Geneva Bible marked the beginning of the modern printed Bible as we now know it. Early in the reign of King James I, a proposal was brought to the king to authorize the commission of a new official translation of the Bible to update and replace the Bishop's Bible. The Geneva Bible was still the most popular English translation, and the king hoped that the new translation would succeed in replacing it. The translation was commissioned to essentially be a careful revision of the Bishop's Bible, retaining the familiar wording of the previous translation as much as possible without compromising faithfulness to the original Greek and Hebrew. They were also instructed to use the wording of other previous translations like Tyndale, Coverdale, and the Geneva wherever it was more faithful than the Bishop's Bible. Thus, the King James translators were rarely to produce a fresh translation, but were to, as often as possible, choose between the wording used by previous translators. Since these previous translations were often much older, this resulted in a King James that retained some language that was dated. The King James Version included the Apocrypha as an appendix. The translators did not hold the books to be inspired, but considered them valuable for their historical content and their place in Christian tradition. For the New Testament, the King James translators consulted the Greek texts of the various editions of Erasmus, as well as later revisions of his work by Stephanos and Theodore Beza. They compared these editions to one another and tried to make the best decisions they could as to the original reading of any given verse. The King James of 1611 was not identical to the traditional King James of today. It took on its more or less formal form now familiar to us in 1769 in the revision of Benjamin Blayney. Contemporary English translations. The Blayney revision of the King James Version remained essentially the English translation from 1769 until the 20th century. At the time, another era of English translation dawned, and many new versions came into popular use in both personal study and worship. Among the most widely accepted were the New International Version, NIV, first published in 1978, the New American Standard Bible, NASB, first published in 1971. Like the King James before them, these translations have both undergone revisions since their first publication and will likely see more in the future. The New King James Version, NKJV of 1982, has also proven a significant contribution to contemporary development of English translations. And in more recent years, the English Standard Version, ESV, the Christian Standard Bible, CSB, the New English Translation, NET, and many others have also attained notable usage. Conclusion: most contemporary English-speaking Christians are not dogmatically committed to only one particular translation, but often read from several, like me. Modern translations have not supplanted the classic King James version, which is still widely read and quoted. Instead, these translations have come alongside it and added to the study tools of the modern Christian to aid in understanding. And understanding has always been the point of translation since the beginning of Christianity. Kini si Nene Rubrico nagapasalamat og nagaingon diya sa Biblia sa Panultihon 29 bersikulo 18. Ang nasod nga dili giyan sa Dios dili matigayon. God bless you.